Hey Vine Church, welcome to this new series we're starting today on the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk as we think through how to trust God in troubling times. The first half of the 20th century was a moment where the world was plunged into a very troubling time. There was Spanish flu epidemic, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Holocaust, and as the world was kind of entering into the second half of the 20th century, there was mass starvation. There was just this economic collapse. And in that moment, the London preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones started preaching. He came to the book of Habakkuk. He opened it up and began to preach because he said that if we understood the message of the prophet Habakkuk, we wouldn't be surprised when troubling times hit. The prophet Habakkuk is living in troubling times. His nation is spiraling down morally and socially. There are threats outside the nation of Israel, which he is facing, the Babylonian army coming for them at some point in the next decade or two. But within the nation itself, Habakkuk looks around and sees a society that's falling apart morally and socially. And he's a man with a burden. If you've got a Bible, open up the book of Habakkuk because it begins like this. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. That word prophecy literally means burden. Habakkuk is a man with a burden, a great burden on his heart. He looks around his society and he sees so much violence, and it leads him to have questions about where is God in the midst of this moment in history. He is a man with a burden, and the book of Habakkuk really hinges on these two questions that he poses to God. The first question is in chapter 1, starts at verse 2. The second question is in chapter 1, verse 11. So you get these two questions, and then God answers Habakkuk's questions in verse 5 of chapter 1 and verse 2 of chapter 2. So you have question, answer, and then chapter 3 is Habakkuk's prayer, or really it's a prayer that he put to song. And it's something of a resolution to the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk goes from questioning and doubting to rejoicing, and that's the movement of the book. And over the next 5 weeks, we as a church, we're going to be studying this book as it teaches us how to trust God in troubling times. And we're going to learn in particular how to pray or lament, week 1. We're going to learn how to trust, week 2, how to wait, week 3, how to be humbled, week 4, and how to rejoice, even in troubling times, week 5. Now, Habakkuk his name literally means refreshing. The word Habakkuk, it's a name for a fruit tree or a garden plant, and it's also the name from the root to embrace or kiss. And what does a kiss or embrace have in common with a fruit tree or a garden plant? They're both refreshing. So a couple of weeks ago, Kate, Stace and Andy Bryan, they sent me and my wife a box of fruit. It was at Easter. I think they thought, not going to send him chocolate, which was great. And we got this box of fruit, and inside the box of fruit there was a papaya, and I left it a week so that it would ripen, and took it out of the fridge last week on one of those hot days, cut into it, and then drank in all its sweet, refreshing flesh. Refreshing. My son, he loves it when he sees people kiss on the lips. And anyway, sometimes he takes my wife, Liz, and he'll put 2 hands on her cheeks and plonk a kiss right on her lips. And then he'll go, on the lips! And with these big eyes and a big bit of excitement, he laughs about it. It's refreshing. Papaya and a kiss, it's refreshing. And that's what Habakkuk means. He's refreshing. Why is he refreshing? Well, because he's different. Because when troubling times come, he doesn't bury his head in the sand and pretend, no, everything's good, we can trust God, God will get me out of this mess. No. He asks very honest questions. So he's refreshing. He asks honest questions, but he doesn't walk away from God either. He's so different from most people in our world. So if you've got a Bible, open it up. We're looking at the book of Habakkuk, and I want you to see what Habakkuk's complaint, what his question of God is. Look down at verse 2 of Habakkuk. How long, Lord, Habakkuk asked, must I call for help? But you don't listen. Or cry to you violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. So this is everyday life in Israel. The prophet Habakkuk is living in the south in Judah, around about the end of the 7th century. I get my dates mixed up, but it's the northern kingdom of Israel's been wiped out, and the southern kingdom, Habakkuk is going to hear, is about to be wiped out by the Babylonian army. And that's where Habakkuk's at, and he's within a society that is just brutal. It's destructive. There's violence all around him. The law, verse 4, is paralyzed. It's like a game of sport where the umpire is making calls, but no one listens to the umpire. You know, John Calvin said that the law, the best law in the world is powerless when its statutes aren't upheld. And that's Israel. It has the best law in the world, but no one is upholding the law. And the result, when the law is paralyzed, verse 4, is that justice never prevails. And the wicked hem in the righteous. So here is a brutal, oppressive, violent, wicked society. And Habakkuk looks around, and this society is meant to be the nation chosen by God to show the rest of the world what it looks like to follow God. And it's just disintegrating morally and socially. And so Habakkuk has a burden on his heart. How long, O Lord, will you stand back and allow this to happen in your people, in the life of your people? He cries out for help, but no help comes. You know, we teach our children that God answers prayer in one of three ways. He either says yes, no, or not yet. But Habakkuk's asking, well, if not now, when? How long must I look at violence and you do nothing, God? Where are you? Why have you abandoned us? Why won't you do something? You know, in the 2007 Zimbabwean political crisis, a 16-year-old girl, Tanya Hunt, wrote a letter that called on the world for help. She wrote, "Dear world, it's tough here. We're starving now. People die around us. Our once proud nation is on its knees. We're tired, broken, bankrupt. We're waiting desperately for a hand to pick us up out of the dirt. There must be someone out there who can do something. Help us." Signed, a 16-year-old Zimbabwean. How long will you not listen? That's Habakkuk's question to God. God, why is there so much injustice? And that in the life of your own people. Why don't you do something? This is his burden. How long? And God answers his question. He isn't offended by questions. God says, hey, bring your questions to me. He loves it. And he says, thank you for your questions, Habakkuk. And he answers his questions in verse 5. He says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. He says to Habakkuk, look, I'm going to give you an answer to your question, how long? I'm going to tell you what I'm about to do, but you're not going to understand it. It's like Habakkuk goes, no, tell me, please. And God says, well, here it is, verse 6. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honour. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an evil swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their own God. This is God's answer. And Habakkuk is like, what? You're going to use the Babylonians? He's like, yes, there's injustice and violence within my nation. But God, you're going to use an even more violent, an even more evil, an even more corrupt nation to judge our nation? You've got to be kidding, don't you? He goes on, verse 12, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. You hear the almost ridicule in Habakkuk's questioning of God. He is emotionally incredibly honest in bringing his questions to God, in bringing his doubts to God. He's looking at this Babylonian war machine who are swift and fierce. God describes them like leopards, wolves, and eagles, intent on devouring their prey. He says they're like an unstoppable hurricane blowing away people as though they're just sand. And Habakkuk asks, you're using them? Are you serious? Them? And this is part of Habakkuk's burden. Not just his original question, he has two questions in the book of Habakkuk. First of all, God, why don't you do something about our nation? And then his second is how are you using them to do something about our nation? It's hard to stomach. But he eats God's answer to his question. He doesn't ignore the answer. He allows God's answer to challenge him, to search him. You know, most people, they ask God questions, but they're not willing to wait for the answer. Or when they do hear the answer, they laugh it off. They reject it out of hand. But here's the thing. If you're not willing to allow God to give you an answer that you've never thought of, that actually challenge you, what's the point? What's the point of learning and listening if the only things that you're willing to accept are the things which you already agree with? What's the point of listening to God if you're not willing to allow him to challenge you? You know, you can be sure that you've got a God of your own imagination, not a real God, is if God only says things and does things that you agree with. If he's real, and he really is the God of the universe, whose wisdom and greatness far exceeds your own, then sometimes he's going to do things which make you question. And in moments like that, there's no point rejecting his answer. You need to swallow it, eat it, digest it, allow it to challenge your thinking. That's what Habakkuk does. But he doesn't stop asking questions. He keeps asking God, what? Them? Are you serious? God, I don't understand this. And that's why Habakkuk is so refreshing. He has the emotional honesty to voice his doubts to God. He is honest. You know, he's way more honest. Tim Keller says that Habakkuk is way more honest than most religious people. See, most religious people in the world, they think that, you know, in order to be religious, in order for God to accept them, they've got to keep their words to God in prayer within some kind of safe, respectable manner. But throughout the Bible, God keeps inviting us to tell him exactly how we're feeling. 1/3 of the Psalms in the Old Testament, the songs, the prayers of the Old Testament, are these laments, these protests to God, telling God, pouring out our emotions to God in prayer. You have people like Job, who for chapters in the book of Job is incredibly long, and it's just this man Job who suffers immensely, telling God, this sucks. It absolutely sucks, God. Why have you done this to me? God is inviting us to pour out our hearts to him. Habakkuk is way more honest than most religious people, but here's the other refreshing thing about him. He doesn't walk away. Most secular people, they have massive questions for God. Evil and God can't exist because of evil and suffering. There's that famous video when Stephen Fry is asked, what happens if he does die and he finds himself in the presence of God? And he says, he comments on the suffering of the world, and he says, how dare you, God? Most people walk away from God, but Habakkuk is refreshing. He brings his questions and objections to God in prayer, but he doesn't walk away. He's more honest than religious people, but he stays, unlike the rest of the world. There are no cliches. He asks the questions of God brutally, and so he's so refreshing. He's a model to us of what it looks like to trust God in troubling times. We pray honestly, and the technical name for this kind of prayer is we lament. A lament is when we pour out our negative emotions to God in prayer. We don't sit on our problems. We don't close our eyes to the problems. We turn our problems over to God. Even our problems with God, we turn them over to God in prayer, telling him exactly how we feel. And I just want to finish by sharing with you, what does that look like? We need to get this. By God's grace, our nation's been spared, I think, what could have been a great catastrophe in the current crisis. Many people have lost their jobs, and that is difficult, and the financial impact of this crisis will be immense for many of us, but the health implications, we've largely been spared. But here's the thing, if it hasn't hit us now, as things kind of return to normal over the next couple of months, but if it doesn't hit us now, at some point in your future, real troubling times will hit. And you need to be prepared for that. And you need to know how to pray. If you don't get your prayer life working now, you are completely going to be unprepared for hard times when they hit. So how do you lament? Well, there are 4 steps really to a prayer of lament. You see this throughout the Psalms, and that is we turn, we complain, we ask, and we trust. The first step that Habakkuk does, and we need to do, is we turn to God. We don't turn to Netflix, we don't turn to whiskey or wine or mindfulness or eating. As good as all those things are, they don't actually help us deal with our negative emotions. They distract us from our negative emotions. Habakkuk teaches us that we're to turn to God when life is difficult. We don't try and clean up our lives before God will accept us. No, we go to him. We go straight to him. And that's why Habakkuk's refreshing. He doesn't turn away from God, which so often we're tempted to do when troubling times hit us. He turns to God. That's the first thing. Secondly, he complains. He is incredibly honest in his complaint to God. He questions God. And he doesn't kind of tidy it up, make it nice, neat, and kind of respectful to God. He isn't respectful. He says, God, you've appointed them to execute judgment? Who do you think you are? God is big enough and strong enough for us to hear that. Now notice, he doesn't complain on Twitter. He doesn't complain on his blogs. He doesn't complain to his friends. He complains to God. He brings his complaint to God, and he's honest. He pours out his feeling. He tells God how angry he is, how perplexed he is, how afraid he is. how scared he is. He tells him what he's feeling. He complains. You turn, you complain, but then you ask God for some kind of remedy. You ask God to save us, save our nation. Do something. Don't sit there doing nothing, God. Please come. Here's my need. Will you answer my need? And that's what we need to do. Turn to God, complain, but ask Him to step into our lives and to do something about it. And then the final thing He does is He trusts. He remembers who God is. Lord, are you not from everlasting? Verse 12. My God, my Holy One, you will never die. He goes on over and over and he reminds himself who God is. He reminds himself, the psalmists, they remind themselves of God's past mercies to them. The Apostle Paul says that we're to bring our petitions, our requests, our prayers to God always with thanksgiving. And sometimes it's very hard to give thanks and to praise God and to express our trust to God in the midst of the dark nights of the soul. But when we do that, it's almost as though we breathe out our complaints, our emotions to God. But then it's very important that we inhale the truth about God, and that's what ministers to our souls. You know, I keep finding myself teaching on this topic of lament, and yet when I'm going through hard times in my life, I don't listen to my own teaching about it, and I'm trying to work this out. You know, usually when troubling times hit me, I complain. My wife hears about, oh, why does this happen? Why does this happen? And I vent to her, and it doesn't really help. Or I go surfing and I try and just distract myself from it, or I watch Netflix, and I kind of have this relationship with Netflix of having it and then getting rid of it because it takes up too much of my time. And really what I'm trying to do right now is, no, when troubling times hit, first it's a prompt for me to turn to God and to tell Him how I'm feeling and to ask for help and to remind myself that He has been good to me in the past. I can trust Him. You see, we have something that Habakkuk did not have. We have the gift of God's only Son, so that when we're feeling abandoned and forgotten, we remember, no, God hasn't abandoned us. If He gave His Son to death on a cross, He will not abandon us. Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, neither the present, nor the future, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. I wonder if you believe that. If we believe that, we'd turn to God when troubling times happen and complain, ask, and then trust Him. You know, God isn't threatened by our questions. Christianity really is a religion which invites strong questions. And it's when we ask strong questions that our faith is actually made stronger. Let me finish with this. You know, Christianity, its beauty is best seen when it's challenged with questions. It's a little bit like if you owned a great piece of artwork and you wanted others to come in and behold that artwork. Would you put it in a gallery where the lights were dim, where you couldn't really see whether it had any imperfections or not? No. If you truly trusted that this artwork was the greatest artwork that was ever painted, you'd put it in a gallery and you would shine all the lights of it and invite anyone to come and scrutinize the artwork because you believed it was the best. And Christianity is like that. Jesus says, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I am the life. If He is, then Christianity can never be threatened by strong questions. See Christianity in all the light. Scrutinize it as much as you want. God invites our questions because it's true. It's good and it's beautiful. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so Habakkuk prays. He laments. He turns to God. He asks every question that comes to him. He doesn't censor any of them. God says, thank you for your questions, Habakkuk. Here's my answer. You're not going to understand it, but you can trust me. And so Habakkuk asks, and then he trusts God. And by the end of this book, he's rejoicing. And if you stay with us over the next 5 weeks, that's my hope, my prayer for you, that you might learn to pray, to lament in troubling times, that you might learn to trust God, wait for his deliverance, be humbled as you wait, and finally that you might rejoice in troubling times. Now, as Christians, we tend to sing upbeat, happy clappy songs a lot of the time praising God. But one of the things I've been noticing is we don't have laments as part of the songs that we sing at church. And we actually need to address that. And so today I've asked Nate to lead us in a song of lament. Now, as you notice the words in this song, some of the words, they're going to be actually quite honest. But we need these as part of our repertoire as we sing as a church. Many people come to church each week and they've had terrible weeks. They're asking very honest questions. And when the only songs we sing about are how great God is, we actually emotionally hinder them in connecting with God. 1/3 of the songs in the Bible are songs of lament. And so we're going to sing a song now. Nate's going to teach it to us. It's a song of lament, and I hope that it gives you the vocabulary for when you are in your troubling time. God bless you, Vine Church. Have a great week.